What we see is the Russians are looking for every opportunity, regardless of party, regardless of whether or not it applies to the election, to continue their pervasive efforts to undermine our fundamental values.
That was National Intel Director Dan Coates at yesterday's White House news conference, warning about the threat of Russian meddling in U.S. elections. This amid new reports of a suspected Russian spy was caught by U.S. authorities after he worked at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow for more than a decade. Former CIA operative Scott Uehlinger joins us now. First of all, let's talk about the presser that happened. Then we can talk about this mole in the embassy in Moscow. The fact is that the Russians never stopped spying, never stopped trying to upset our authority in terms of democracy in the United States since the Soviet Union. And we have Putin, who was a former KGB spy. All of our intel sources, from Coates to Pompeo to John Bolton, they all knew that, but there was this impression that the media was spinning after the Helsinki meeting with Putin and Trump that somehow Trump was a puppet of Putin. But everybody in his administration knows exactly what the score is.
That's right, and certainly our policies, directed for Russia are much stronger than they were during the Obama period. But it was important to have this press conference as a way of resting assured, the American people as well as Russia, to put them, under warning that we will not tolerate this. We must defer and defend against this type of incursion.
But I think the message was more to Americans than it was to Russians, because the Russians know that Pompeo's not an idiot, that Coates is not an idiot, that John Bolton has been talking about Russian intrusion in our process for years, decades.
That's right. There's always, Russia's goal is always to sow dissension in the United States. However, I would also argue the liberal mainstream media, by constantly emphasizing this fake Russian collusion story, they're actually empowering President Putin of Russia, making him appear more influential in U.S. policy and U.S. politics than he actually is.
Right. Let's talk about the mole in Moscow. This is kind of an interesting situation. It's almost like a John le Carré novel, where you try to spot the mole. He'd been there for a decade. This guy really infiltrated deep into the embassy.
What a lot of Americans don't understand is that U.S. embassies abroad hire a great deal of Foreign Service nationals, local hires to be drivers, cooks, or assistants. In this case, it was a female who was working as an assistant to the U.S. Secret Service, which has a presence there. Now, what we need to do is the United States and Western countries in general need to take a more careful look at how they employ local hires. It's interesting to note that Russia, China, North Korea, and countries like Cuba do not hire local hire talent for anything. They have their own drivers, their own cooks, and they bring them in.
One would think you'd be as safe about Moscow. I mean, U.S.
It's a CI problem.
How much information could this woman have made available to herself?
I mean, her access was nothing like top secret. However, she did have access to sensitive information like the travel schedules of American diplomats.
That's pretty sensitive.
Visiting American officials. So the United States...
That would tell the Kremlin a lot about where we were moving, where our priorities were, et cetera.
Right, and so that's why we need to re-examine perhaps the role of some of our FSNs with access to potentially sensitive information. The CIA is not going to have a lot of FSNs, but the Department of State, the Secret Service, and even the FBI are going to have a fair amount of Foreign Service nationals working at their posts in our embassies overseas.
Bottom line is, after Helsinki, the president immediately said, we're going to have another meeting, we're going to invite Putin to Washington. That has now been delayed. Is it a good thing that in light of all that's happened, we take a long, deep breath now before we decide what the next step is with Russia?
Certainly, I think that's true. But we also have to remember that even in the days when President Reagan was speaking to Gorbachev, there was still an ongoing espionage war, because that's what nations do to one another. This is an ongoing espionage war that flares up in publicity, sometimes goes away, but it's ever present. And it's in the background of diplomatic negotiation. So we have to always look at that while we approach the Russians for diplomacy, but diplomacy must continue.
Scott Uehlinger, great to see you, man. Thank you very much.